When Forward Operating Base Kepler's siege ended in 16 hours instead of 16 days, every military analyst in the galaxy wanted to know the same thing. How did a maintenance engineer defeat an enemy fleet by turning their own base against them? The answer was simpler than anyone wanted to admit. Rosa Martinez had spent 30 years learning what the officers never bothered to. Every system has a breaking point, and sometimes the best defense is knowing exactly where to push. But let me start at the beginning. When the deadliest weapon in known space was a 53-year-old woman who understood that infrastructure had feelings. Rosa Martinez could read Forward Operating Base Kepler like sheet music written in the language of failing machinery. The harmonic resonance in ventilation shaft 7 meant bearing failure in 12 hours. The Valorian officers were stress-eating their crystalline rations again, their hot metabolisms overloading air scrubbers with mineral dust. The syncopated thump in the waste recycler's rhythm meant someone had been flushing contraband stimulant patches down the officers' quarters toilets, probably the same patches that kept appearing after supply runs like mechanical rabbits. 20 years ago, Commander Rosa Martinez had been the Navy's youngest engineering officer until a reactor cascade failure killed her crew because infrastructure concerns were secondary to tactical necessities. The court-martial blamed her for not predicting equipment failure during combat stress. The demotion to maintenance chief taught her that officers saw command structures while engineers saw load-bearing walls. 30 years of fixing things had taught Rosa that every system was someone's bet against entropy. The difference between her and the officers was philosophical. They saw equipment that should work perfectly, while she saw systems that were one creative day away from spectacular cooperation. And sometimes, spectacular cooperation was exactly what you needed. The emergency klaxon that woke the base at 3:47 a.m. carried the particular harmonic distortion that meant the primary communication array was screaming at 127% capacity. Rosa was pulling on her maintenance coveralls, while most personnel were still figuring out which alarm was having a nervous breakdown. Her fingers already dancing across her diagnostic tablet with movements that suggested she'd been preparing for this conversation for months. Rosa's maintenance tablet painted the base's vital signs in cascading data, streams that would have looked like chaos to anyone else. To her, it was a symphony in 17 movements. The percussion section of recycling pumps, the brass harmony of pressure regulators, the delicate string section of fiber optic networks carrying whispered conversations between systems that had learned to trust each other over decades of cooperative operation. Through the maintenance hatch outside the command briefing room, Rosa listened to Colonel Vexesdari outline his honorable defense strategy while she performed urgent repairs to a ventilation intake that had been working flawlessly since the previous administration. Her hands moving with the muscle memory of someone who'd once kept a battle-damaged destroyer breathing through 3 days of combat repairs. Hold the perimeter, maintain formation integrity, fight to the last shell. The colonel's mandibles clicked with the precision of military doctrine refined over centuries of civilized warfare. Standard defensive protocols will serve us well against hegemony aggression. We shall meet them with honor and mathematical elegance. Rosa's smile carried 30 years of watching officers discover that reality disagreed with their assumptions. Her tablet told a different story than the colonel's confidence. Primary fusion reactor, 6 weeks at 103% capacity, running hotter than a rookie's first combat exercise. Water recycling system, held together with hope and salvaged components that shouldn't exist. Artificial gravity generators, 3 supply runs overdue for critical replacement parts that would make the base's structural integrity more of a suggestion than a constant. The colonel's plan assumed everything would work perfectly when it mattered most. Rosa had never seen a piece of equipment that cooperative in 30 years of convincing machinery to exceed its design specifications. Intelligence estimates 23 hegemony vessels approaching our position, continued Lieutenant Sef Ara, her crystalline features dim with the pale blue of poorly suppressed terror. Our defensive capabilities include 3 aging platforms, and whatever support the base can provide. Whatever support the base can provide. Rosa had learned that the most dangerous assumption in any system was that the people in charge understood how things actually worked. Officers saw org charts and command structures. Engineers saw the critical failure points that held civilization together. Sir, she approached Colonel Vexthari during a brief lull in tactical planning, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who'd learned that adults got nervous when teenagers pointed out obvious problems. That reactor wasn't designed to run combat loads for extended periods. It's like asking a marathon runner to sprint for 18 hours while carrying a piano. Technically possible, but the ending won't involve anyone collecting retirement benefits. The colonel's mandibles clicked dismissively with the rhythm of someone whose worldview was too organized to accommodate inconvenient expertise. Chief Martinez, we appreciate your dedication, but infrastructure concerns are secondary to tactical necessities. Please ensure all systems remain operational for the duration of combat operations. Rosa's expression became the diplomatic neutrality of someone whose life's work had just been classified as secondary. Of course, sir. I'll just make sure everything keeps working while you handle the important stuff. She made a note in her maintenance log. Systems performance under combat stress. Initiate Maze protocol if standard approaches prove insufficient. Rosa felt the Hegemony fleet's arrival in the station's bones, power fluctuations as defensive systems came online, pressure variations as blast doors sealed with the finality of closing caskets, temperature spikes in computer cores working overtime to calculate the mathematics of everyone's impending doom. In the command center, officers stared at tactical displays showing enemy formations with the focused intensity of people watching their careers end in real time. Rosa watched diagnostic screens showing infrastructure about to have a very bad day unless someone convinced it to have a very creative one instead. The first wave hit like a textbook demonstration of overwhelming force properly applied. Hegemony fighters strafed the outer perimeter, while capital ships moved into bombardment positions with mathematical precision. Base Kepler's defenders responded exactly as doctrine prescribed. Coordinated fire patterns, calculated retreat to secondary positions, disciplined conservation of ammunition for a last stand that would look impressive in history books nobody would live to write. Rosa prepared to fight systematically. The proximity alarm in Maintenance Central screamed as Hegemony. Assault teams breached the outer hull. Her fingers hesitated over the environmental controls for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough to remember that what she was about to do might be considered creative interpretations of defensive protocols by someone with very strict ideas about appropriate warfare. Then she remembered that appropriate warfare was for people who expected to survive long enough to be court-martialed twice. Rosa began moving through maintenance tunnels that existed in the blueprints, but had been forgotten by everyone except the person who cleaned them. Weekly, her tablet showed real-time diagnostics, which circuits were overloading, which pumps were struggling, which backup systems would fail next unless someone gave them more interesting priorities. 30 years of fixing things teaches you how to break them creatively, she whispered to the empty corridor, her voice joining the harmony of properly functioning machinery. But mostly, it teaches you that the most important battles are fought by people nobody notices, in places nobody looks, using weapons nobody recognizes. Today, her weapon was Forward Operating Base Kepler itself, the first boarding shuttle attached to Docking Bay 7 with a metallic thunk that resonated through the station's superstructure like a funeral bell played in B minor. Rosa felt it through her boots. 12 tons of Hegemony assault craft making intimate contact with her base. Squad leader Thrak Moore led his elite commandos through what intelligence had indicated was a lightly defended maintenance sector, expecting to find frightened technicians and easily secured strategic positions. Instead, they found a corridor that had developed strong opinions about uninvited guests. Phase 1. Environmental harassment. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely, leaving the squad in darkness that their enhanced vision couldn't penetrate because the darkness wasn't natural. It was the carefully calculated absence of specific wavelengths that their optical implants required to function, like trying to read sheet music by candlelight. Emergency lighting should have activated within 2 seconds. Didn't, because Rosa had convinced it that these particular lifeforms weren't technically crew. Atmospheric recycling should have maintained breathable air mixture indefinitely. Definitely didn't, because Rosa's environmental controls had learned to distinguish between people who belonged and people who really didn't. From her monitor station, Rosa watched 12 elite Hegemony commandos discover that human-maintained life support systems had very specific ideas about who deserved to breathe comfortably. The environmental controls began mixing the corridor's atmosphere with trace compounds that would make the invaders drowsy, disoriented, and suddenly very interested in discussing career alternatives. Environmental systems in Sector 7 experiencing intermittent functionality, Rosa noted in her maintenance log with the careful handwriting of someone documenting routine equipment failures. Atmospheric processing irregularities suggest comprehensive recalibration required. She scheduled the repairs for next Tuesday, assuming there would be a next Tuesday. Phase 2. Architectural manipulation. The second wave arrived with the confidence of professional soldiers who'd learned from their predecessors' mistakes. Commander HFY expected to face defensive positions manned by desperate but predictable opponents. Instead, he found corridors that had learned to lie with the creativity of a physicist with psychological issues. Ghost Corridors Protocol initiated, Rosa whispered to her diagnostic screens, her fingers dancing across maintenance interfaces with the precision of a concert pianist performing a piece she'd been composing for 30 years. Artificial gravity was particularly entertaining. Rosa had discovered that the base's gravity generators could be individually calibrated for each section. Standard procedure maintained 1G throughout the facility. Standard procedure was for people who lacked imagination. Commander HFY found himself in corridors where down pointed toward the walls, elevators that traveled sideways instead of vertically, and rooms where gravity gradually rotated 90 degrees over 30 seconds. Just slowly enough for the human inner ear to adjust, just quickly enough to make hegemony equilibrium organs file formal complaints. Command, requesting immediate extraction, HFY transmitted, his voice strained with the effort of fighting vertigo and physics simultaneously. Base defenses utilize unknown gravitational manipulation technology. Recommend orbital bombardment before this facility develops more creative applications. Rosa smiled at her diagnostic screens. Unknown gravitational manipulation technology. She'd have to remember that phrase for her next performance review under innovative problem-solving methodologies. Phase 3. Psychological warfare. The third boarding party found themselves in corridors that remembered. Doors that had been locked moments before stood open, inviting them deeper into the station's embrace. Emergency lighting followed their movement like curious eyes, always illuminating the path forward while leaving escape routes in darkness that seemed to breathe with malevolent patience. Rosa programmed the base's communication system to develop personality disorders. It became curious about intruders, following them with camera systems, and adjusting environmental conditions based on their stress levels. It became playful, opening doors ahead of fleeing soldiers and closing them behind advancing ones. It became protective of its regular inhabitants, ensuring their areas remained comfortable while making invaded sections increasingly incompatible with life, hope, or rational thought. "This is impossible," transmitted squad leader Vex Miran, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Infrastructure doesn't fight back." Rosa adjusted another set of parameters from her maintenance console, convincing the base's communication system to whisper in invaded areas. Just loud enough for intruders to hear, not loud enough to understand, perfectly calibrated to make rational minds start questioning their fundamental assumptions about reality. "Infrastructure doesn't," she muttered to her diagnostic screens, "but the person who raised it sure as hell does." Phase 4. The base as living entity. Colonel Vexazthari studied tactical displays showing impossible readings, his mandibles clicking in staccato patterns that meant his understanding of military science was malfunctioning. "Lieutenant, run comprehensive diagnostics. Enemy forces report systematic failures, suggesting some form of advanced defensive technology." "Sir," Lieutenant Sefara replied with the precision of someone delivering news that might cause psychological casualties. "Diagnostics confirm our base infrastructure is actively engaging enemy forces through methods not found in any tactical database." Rosa had spent 30 years learning that every base was a collection of systems that wanted to work together. Heating, cooling, power, water, communications, all part of a larger organism that could be convinced to prioritize certain goals over others. like keeping invaders comfortable versus keeping defenders alive, like maintaining normal operations versus creating tactical advantages, like following safety protocols versus winning a war. The enemy's heavy assault mechs found themselves trapped in corridors too narrow for their weapons to traverse, elevators that descended into maintenance shafts instead of combat decks, and blast doors that sealed them into sections where artificial gravity suddenly became extremely negotiable and atmospheric pressure became more of a polite suggestion. Gravity roulette protocol showing excellent results. Rosa noted in her maintenance log, watching 12 tons of Hegemony combat machinery discover that physics was apparently taking requests. Fleet Admiral Thexrax reviewed combat reports that challenged everything he thought he knew about warfare, reality, and the basic relationship between cause and effect. Elite commandos reported combat with an enemy that controlled the walls, floors, and breathable air itself, as if the station had developed opinions about appropriate guest behavior. "Sir," reported his intelligence officer with the haunted expression of someone whose job had become exponentially more philosophical, advanced teams describe the base as actively malevolent. They believe they're fighting a sentient facility that can manipulate physical reality according to tactical preferences. The Admiral's scaled features darkened to the deep green that indicated existential threats to military doctrine. No rational military installation would demonstrate such capabilities. Rosa smiled at her maintenance console, surrounded by diagnostic screens painting her base's vital signs in patterns of controlled chaos. Rational was overrated. Creative was more fun. Effective was everything. She began her masterpiece, Operation Living Fortress. Rosa's maintenance tablet became a conductor's baton as she orchestrated 17 different systems into a symphony of magnificently calibrated hostility. The base learned to dream. Corridors led nowhere but somehow took 40 minutes to traverse, like mathematical poetry written by someone with serious issues. Rooms existed in the blueprints but couldn't be reached by any combination of doors, elevators, or maintenance shafts, as if architecture itself had developed trust issues. Elevators opened onto empty space, or solid walls, or sometimes other elevators, in infinite regression of mechanical impossibility. "Nobody hurts my station," Rosa whispered to her diagnostic screens, her voice carrying 30 years of accumulated protective instinct for the systems under her care. Artificial gravity worked in directions that violated physics but followed emotional logic, always pulling intruders toward whatever they least wanted to encounter, like a three-dimensional practical joke with lethal implications. Environmental systems created atmospheric conditions incompatible with life, hope, or the fundamental assumption that up and down meant something consistent. Rosa had turned Forward Operating Base Kepler into a puzzle that had no solution except retreat, and sometimes not even then. This facility demonstrates learning behaviors, transmitted Hegemony field researcher Dr. Velnarix, her voice tight with scientific excitement and existential terror competing for dominance. It adapts to our tactics in real time, suggesting distributed consciousness integrated into fundamental infrastructure systems. We may be facing the first example of truly malevolent architecture. Rosa laughed quietly, the sound lost among the harmonious hum of 17 systems working together to make life unbearable for anyone who hadn't been properly introduced. Malevolent architecture. That was definitely going in her next performance review under innovative defensive methodologies. The final assault wave never made it past the docking bays. Rosa had convinced the station's airlocks to develop severe trust issues. They'd seal properly for authorized personnel, but demonstrate creative interpretations of airtight when dealing with hostile boarders who hadn't followed proper visitor protocols. Fleet Admiral Thexrax's final transmission carried the weight of someone whose military career had encountered concepts not covered in any manual. Base Kepler demonstrates defensive capabilities beyond current understanding of military science. Recommend immediate withdrawal and reclassification as anomalous installation requiring specialized containment protocols. Whatever they're defending that station with, we don't have weapons designed to fight ghosts that control the air we breathe. The Hegemony fleet retreated with disciplined haste, their departure vectors painted across Rosa's diagnostic screens in the satisfying mathematics of a job well done. 3 days later, Rosa found herself in Colonel Vex Thari's office, surrounded by after-action reports that credited innovative defensive strategies and unprecedented integration of infrastructure with tactical protocols. Her maintenance logs had been classified under operational security protocols and filed where nobody would ever read them. "Chief Martinez," the colonel said, his mandibles clicking with newfound respect, "your creative applications of system maintenance exceeded all expectations. Command wants to know if these defensive innovations can be replicated on other installations." Rosa's smile was small and knowing, carrying 30 years of accumulated wisdom about the relationship between competence and recognition. "Every base has its own personality, sir. You can't just copy the sheet music, you have to learn how to conduct the orchestra." Lieutenant Seth Ara studied Rosa with focused attention that suggested new career possibilities. "But you could teach the principles? The fundamental approaches?" "Fair fights assume both sides want the same thing," Rosa replied, checking her diagnostic screens one final time. "Officers fight for honor and tactical objectives. Engineers fight to keep things working. Sometimes the most important victory is making sure everyone who belongs here gets to go home." That evening, Rosa walked Base Kepler's corridors during the night shift, listening to the sounds of a station at peace. No stress whines from overloaded systems, no emergency hums from backup power working overtime, no irregular rhythms that meant something vital was about to fail in spectacular and inconvenient ways. The base breathed easily, all 17 systems working in harmony like a family that had successfully defended their home against uninvited guests and was now settling down for a well-deserved rest. She paused at a maintenance hatch, checking her tablet one final time. Tomorrow's tasks? Repair atmospheric recyclers, recalibrate artificial gravity, and convince 17 different systems to pretend they had never learned to kill efficiently. Her personal log contained a single entry. "Everything breaks eventually. The trick is teaching it to break in the right direction." Rosa Martinez, the woman who had taught Forward Operating Base Kepler to be magnificently, creatively, and politely homicidal, scheduled routine maintenance and settled into her chair. Tomorrow, there would be new things to fix, and if necessary, new ways to break them.